Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History of I podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor Nicholas Peter Lee Allen. And today we're going to be discussing the origins of Yahweh. And with that being said, Nicholas, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Jacob. Well, what I'm going to do is try to present what most people think happened, and then I'm going to try and correct that perception by looking at archaeological evidence. Today we hear a lot about people called biblical archaeologists, and I've put up on the screen a picture of a biblical archaeologist. And the problem is that they go into the field not as scientists, but as trying to illustrate what's in the Bible. So they are kind of limiting themselves, and they're not really being scientific, because the Bible now controls and dictates what they want to find. It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if I can say that. So if we look briefly at the normal timeline that's taught at Sunday school and believed by many people, it looks a little bit like this. We see about 4000 BCE, we have the creation, where God supposedly makes everything in 6 days. And then we have a story about the first man and the first woman, and how they, how Eve eats of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and becomes shameful and commits the first sin, if we use the Christian word here, sin. Sin is not a Jewish term, it's a Christian term. And from a Christian perspective, we would then move on to the post-Assyrian period, which just means after the fall. And we have the stories of Cain and Abel, Cain killing Abel, the first man to kill, the flood. That's where God apparently is so upset by the sin in the world that he decides to destroy everybody. We have Noah, who, as everybody knows, built a very large ark where he managed to preserve some of the wildlife on this planet and survived the floods, and basically starts humanity again. And the Tower of Babel story, where God separates people because they're speaking different languages and causing confusion. We have the story of Abraham, who, depending on which timeline you're using, most people will put him around about 2000 to 1500 BCE. And what's always amused me is that Abraham comes on the scene fluent in Hebrew, which is really quite a tall order, considering it wasn't even written down properly until the 8th century. We have the patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. We have the story of the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt. And then we have the Exodus story, which, depending again on your particular belief system and your timeline, can be anything from 1500 to 1100 BCE. The most popular date for that is normally 1200. That's when Moses, of course, meets God face to face on Mount Sinai and receives the 10 Commandments. And then we have the story of Joshua after the Exodus, bringing the children of Israel home to their promised land. And then there are books in the Bible like Judges, which talk about the early period of Israelite occupation, if you like, of the land. And then we have books like Samuel and Kings, which talk about the kings of Israel and Judah. And according to those stories, we're looking at a timeline of around about 1100 up to about 975. And then lastly, the Bible deals with what happened after the kingdom was divided. So we have a story about there being a united kingdom of Israel and Judah, and then we have a story about Israel being destroyed. The capital Samaria is destroyed. And we have the Assyrians, who are now oppressing the Judahites. And then after the Assyrians come the Babylonians or the Neo-Babylonians, and they destroy Jerusalem and destroy Solomon's temple. And then the children of Israel are led off into exile to Babylonia. That is, in a nutshell, the basic story that we are told, and with the time signatures below. So I thought what would be quite interesting is to actually look at all of this in the light of archaeology and substantiated fact. So what I'm going to do is let's have a little look at an incident that happened in around about 1600, just to show you where some of these ideas may have come from. And here I'm talking about the Exodus as an example. The Exodus story may be an embellishment, if you like, or an embroiderment on something that may have happened, but the context is completely lost. And so I'm just going to mention this for a little bit of interest. If we go back to the Middle Kingdom, we can see that the Egyptian kingdom is very closely linked to the Nile River, and your civilization and your main cities are lying along the length of that river. And you can see there in the northeast and the southern Levant, you have the land of Canaan. And interestingly enough, that is accurate from the Bible, because we know that the Egyptians referred to the people who came from that area as Canaanites. Well, I'm translating it, but they would have called it something like Canaan, but we know where the word comes from. So that part is quite accurate, even biblically. But we also know that in around about 1650 BCE, a number of Semitic peoples, we assume Canaanite, we can't prove that, but they could have been Syrian, Canaanite, Semitic peoples, moved into Egypt, into the north of Egypt, which is known as Lower Egypt because it's closer to the ocean. And they took over the north of Egypt and created a capital at a place called Avaris. Now, this is all documented, and we know this actually happened. And they ruled there for about 100 years. And without getting too technical, at one time there were, in fact, 3 kings of Egypt coexisting, because you had indigenous kings of Egypt coexisting with the king in Avaris. And what we know is that in about 1570, a king arose in Thebes called Ahmose, which sounds a lot like Moses, doesn't it? And he started to battle the Canaanites who had settled into the northern Egyptian area. We call them the Hyksos because of an inscription, which has many meanings. One meaning may be shepherd kings. We're not too sure what it means, but they are foreign rulers, basically, foreign rulers. And Ahmose makes it his business to get rid of them. And he does that over a decade, maybe 2 decades of fighting and many, many battles. And to cut a very long story short, he finally attacks Avaris, and ultimately he drives the Hyksos people out of Egypt, and they all run away back to Canaan. Now that actually happened, and Ahmose, the king at that time, then starts what we now call the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is probably one of the most powerful periods in Egyptian history, and features a number of very famous kings, people like Thutmose III, Tutankhamun, for example. They all come from that period. So we have an interesting story here that we have Semitic peoples fleeing from Egypt, but not to go and find the promised land, but simply because they were not wanted. And this actually happened, and it didn't take 40 years. It took them 7 days to get out. So possibly something like this could have been retold over centuries and become an interesting narrative that was borrowed later by the Judahites as part of their myth of having been slaves in Egypt. A possibility, speculation, of course. Okay. So I just put that in there just to show you how stories can be told and how they can be misconstrued. But now let's look at pure history, what we know from archaeology. We know that after that period, after the Hyksos were chased out of Egypt, and Egypt was once again united and ruled by an indigenous king of Egypt, eventually we get, after about 3 or 4 reigns, we come to Thutmose III, who is probably one of the most powerful Egyptian kings to ever have ruled. I'm thinking somebody like Ramses II would come close. But Thutmose III, we in fact refer to him as the Napoleon of Egypt because he did something rather strange. He conquered lands outside of Egypt, which is really unusual. And as you can see on the map, most of the lands that he conquered are in what is today called Israel and Lebanon and parts of Syria. And you'll also notice that the Hittites in the north are competing for the same land. And this is very important because it means the people living in the middle, okay, who are presently called, Israelites and Lebanese, those people were trampled on, literally trampled on, like a roadway between 2 great nations who were battling it out for territorial gain. And what I've done here is I've put a little ring of yellow around Carchemish at the top there, because that was a very famous battle, which was actually lost ultimately by the Egyptians, and the Hittites started to gain back territory. Okay, so that's the situation that we have in the 15th century BCE. And remember that if there had indeed been a Moses at this time trying to flee Egypt because he was a slave and take his estimated 3.5 million people away, he wouldn't have been running out of Egypt. He would have been running into Egypt, which makes the whole exercise quite pointless. We know that in 1457, Thutmose III crushed a Canaanite delegation. They got together and created a huge army to stop Egyptian oppression, and it failed. Megiddo is the site of a major victory for the Egyptians. And for the next 350 odd years, the people living in that region, mostly Canaanites, were under direct Egyptian oppression. And they copied the Egyptians. They lived like Egyptians. They emulated them in many ways. In 1123 BCE, the Egyptians themselves were beaten by the Canaanites at Jaffa. And this is when the story gets really interesting. So they push now the Egyptians out of Canaan after that 350 odd year period of conquest. And then starts the establishment of Canaanite nations, for proper, if I can say that, kingdoms. So this is if you like, we've gone in with a magnifying glass just to look at that little bit of Canaanite territory immediately after the Egyptians had left. And this is, you could say, roughly what the situation looked like from around about 1150 up to about, say, 900. Very rough dates. And you can see that the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel seem to have most of the land there. Jerusalem seems to be an important center in Judah, but we don't think it was a capital at this time. We have Shechem in the north, which is a very important center for the Israelites. In the top, you can see the bit of blue there. That's the southern tip of the Phoenician kingdom. And the Phoenicians have trading ports at Sidon and Tyre on the Mediterranean. To the east is the kingdom of Aram Damascus, the Ammonites to the east, the Moabites to the southeast, and in the south, the Edomites. And then some new kids on the block. Around about 1200, the Egyptians were being pestered by what they called sea peoples. We have no idea where they came from. There have been all sorts of speculations. One was that they were returning from the Trojan War, which I don't buy, but interesting theory. And these people became known as the Philistines. And they occupied what is, in fact, today the Gaza Strip. And by about, I'd say, 1000 to 900, they had already created very important trading ports along the coast. And of course, they also became bitter enemies of the Judahites and the Israelites. And none of these kingdoms really got on with each other. Occasionally, they would team up purely to wage war against one of their neighbors. Okay, now just to show you the influence of the Egyptians, these stela with Egyptian carvings on them, which were done by an Egyptian, were all done in Israel, in northern Israel, which shows that the Egyptian occupation there and administration there was very strong. So I'm just going to show a few of these just to... Now this is very interesting. This is a piece of furniture inlay that comes from Megiddo. It's been dated to between 1300 and 1140. So this is right at the time when the Egyptians have full presence, shall we say, in the southern Levant. And it shows what we believe to be an Israelite king or prince receiving delegations from another Canaanite territory, including some captured prisoners there. And you will notice that the Israelite king is dressed exactly like an Egyptian. He has a bit of a beard, but it's not a full-length beard as you would expect somebody of that persuasion to have. He looks almost as though his head has been shaven, almost like an Egyptian prince. His throne, everything about it, even the style, the way the individuals are walking in the scene, is Egyptian influenced. And flying in the sky, you can see the orb of the sun with wings. And that is their chief deity, which we're assuming was an early manifestation of a god known as Yahweh, who became Yahweh. And we'll talk a bit more about that just now. Below, I've done a diagrammatic copy of that image, just to give you a better idea of what's going on. So this is an Israelite scene. And if you didn't know better, you would say that was an Egyptian scene. Here's a carving of Ramses III seated on his throne at the time when the Egyptians were starting to lose power. Right. Now, the Canaanites as a people have been in the southern Levant region, western Syria, since we guess at about 8000 BCE would be a good guess. Whether they were exactly the same people, we're not sure, but there's been human occupation there since 8000 BCE. It is a very old culture. And some of the deities that they worshipped go right back to around about 2900 BCE. And some of these deities were obviously borrowed from other cultures, and it's very difficult if you're looking at a 4,500 year period to give a step-by-step discourse on what happened exactly and at what time. But what we can say is that there was a lot of swapping, a lot of influence with each other. Gods were cloned by other cultures, renamed, swapped. Their powers were swapped. It's not a consistent situation. So if you look at the Sumerian deities, the three main Sumerian deities, the creator deities, who are the oldest, these go way back to the 3rd millennium. We have Anu, Enlil, and Enki, who are mentioned many times in inscriptions from Sumeria, ancient Sumeria. And I'm going to look at just one deity to show you what happens. So Enki becomes Ea in the Babylonian system, takes on the quality of a god of seas and moisture there. And then he has a son called Marduk, or Bel. Now, Marduk was probably one of the most powerful deities in the, I would say, from the second millennium onwards. He was definitely one of the major deities of the region. And if you read other accounts, Marduk was also a lesser god who was in the circle of Enki. So there are two different stories here, but the most popular one is that Ea is a rebranding, if you like, of Enki, and that Marduk was the son of Ea. And then Marduk has a son called Nabu, and Nabu is the god of wisdom. And because they knew that writing was important for civilization, you cannot have a civilization without writing, he's associated with penmanship and text and recording and records and also prophecy. And then Nabu was borrowed by the Canaanites and became one of their gods. He kept his name and he kept one attribute. He became the god of script or writing. So that's just one example. I mean, there are hundreds of them, and I haven't got time to talk about all of them. Just remember that the Canaanites themselves had at least 273 deities. That's quite mind-boggling when you think about it. So we can say the Canaanites were, from the third millennium onwards, definitely during the second millennium onwards, they were polytheists, but they tended to have one of their deities as being slightly more important than the other and took the role of a creator deity. And for that reason, we have a term that we use to describe polytheism where one god is slightly more important than the others. We call it monolatrism. But even there, I don't think that term satisfies what's actually going on, because these deities, senior deities, also had consorts, wives, and they were worshipped as a pair. So we perhaps need a better name for this. Now, El, who I've put in very large letters in the center of the screen, he dates back to 2900 BC, and he was a deity in his own right, and he was possibly evolved from the desert wind, that's one theory. That he took on more and more powers from other deities, and eventually he became known as a creator deity. If you look at when the Canaanites divided up into distinct nations after the Egyptians left, El was used as a blueprint, if I can put it like that, for the senior deity in each nation. So each nation has a national deity, a national high deity, and very often the name El stops being used to describe a specific god and is used as a title for the main deity. And this is very true of the Israelites. I mean, the word Israel means to struggle with El, okay, to struggle with God. So El becomes a title for the deity. And if anybody has read the Bible in Hebrew, you will know that El is often used as a title to describe the God of the Jewish people. Instead of calling him Yahweh, he's referred to as El, or Adonai, Lord. The same thing happened with Baal. Baal is a very ancient deity. He goes back at least to the end of the third millennium. And Baal also starts to become a title. We have loads of deities who are called Baal something. So Baal becomes, I suppose the best translation would be Lord. So your deity would be called Lord something. Lord something would be called Baal. So Baal and El become titles. One deity who's rather interesting is Ashirdus. If you go to the Hittites, you'll see a creator god of the Hittites called Cooney, and he had a wife called Ashirdus, and she became Asherah. Now, Asherah has many, what can I call it? Many ways that Asherah could have come into being. There are at least 4 different theories, and quite frankly, they could all be right, because goddesses and gods, as I said, got swapped around, renamed, repurposed. So it's very difficult to come up with an exact family tree. But we know that Asherah, one of her roots was from Ashirdus. And she was a creatress god, She was called the creatress. She had the same powers, if you like, as El. She was a very powerful deity. And in the early days of Canaanite civilization, El and Asherah were definitely linked together as a doublet. And they were the major deities of their monolatrist system. The system, by the way, which the Israelites refer to indirectly as the divine council. So in other words, you have a divine council filled with deities, of which 2 is a male and female who are creators at the head of the table, if you like. Now here's where it gets interesting. If you look at Yahweh on the left there, he's the one particular deity who did not have Canaanite origins. We're not sure where Yahweh comes from. The best guess is that he did come from the Sinai, which is interesting because in the Moses story, as you know, he had to go to Sinai to meet him on Mount Sinai. And I will talk more about him just now. But what happened was, he also marries Asherah. Asherah becomes his consort. And they're interesting stories if you want to read them. There's a story, for example, where Baal stole Asherah from Yahweh, and I think either Mot or Hadad censored them for having stolen the deity. But the point is, a lot of gods ended up having a consort wife deity who had a very similar name to Asherah, and I'll show you that just now. So let me move on and try to simplify things. If we just look at the southern Levant and just look at the main deities, the creator deities, the head, if you like, of council for each one of those systems, you've got the Moabites. They called their creator deity Chemosh, and his wife was Astarte. Astarte already has links with Asherah. It could be the same deity, or the 2 have been confused. They have very similar backgrounds. The Israelites worshipped Yahweh and Asherah as their main deities. These Israelites I'm talking about here, we're talking 1000, 900, that sort of period. The Edomites, their deity was called Kos, and we believe that Kos was simply a renaming of El, who had been the major god of all the Canaanites at one time. And he also had a consort, but we don't know her name. We just know she's got horns, so we call her the horn goddess. The Phoenicians, at one time, Baal was the main deity there, and he was married to Asherah, as I mentioned earlier, and also Astarte at different periods. The Ammonites had a god called Milcom, and we do not know the name of his consort. We're not even sure if he had a consort. The Amorites worshipped a god at one time called Amuru, and his consort was also Asherah, and a deity who may be the same deity with a different name. We're not sure. Ashratun. They also worship Dagon. Dagon goes back to the beginning of the 2nd millennium. And they also worshipped at one time a major deity called Teshub. And then I've got 2 boxes edged in yellow to emphasize that these are not Canaanites. although they're in the same region, they are not indigenous to the region. The Aramaeans on the right are actually Syrian-based, and they worshipped Hadad. And you can see there that the consort was a Targatus or Teketo. And the Philistines took over the Amorite deity of Dagon. He became quite powerful by the 10th and 9th centuries, and he was married to a goddess called Shalash. So what I'm trying to show you here is that the systems are almost identical. They just have different names for the deities, if that makes sense. Just a little side issue. Let's talk about Yahoo quickly. As I said, we don't really know where Yahoo comes from. But what is very interesting is that in the Timna Valley, which is very close to the Sinai region, and other places, they have found snakes made out of bronze. And I've actually pasted in here a number of snakes to give you an idea of what they look like. Some of them are gilded in gold, but they're mostly copper or bronze. And it's been theorized because they found over 200 tons of copper waste, slag, at some of these sites, like Timna, for example, that they've been mining there and smelting copper for a long time, probably right back to the middle of the second millennium BCE. And the theory is that perhaps Yahoo started off his life as a minor metallurgical deity. In other words, he was the copper god, because to melt metal was considered really, it's a high state of technology. It's one of the indicators that a culture has reached a really high level. And anybody who can manipulate metals, I'm just thinking of the medieval blacksmith, for example, who was considered to have magical powers. Anybody who can melt metal and transform it into weapons, for example, is considered to be a deity. So it's possible that this is one possible route if you're looking for it. And we have hints in the Bible that this is so, because we have the story of Moses and the brazen serpent, which everybody had to go to and venerate if they wanted to be cured from snakebite. Rather interesting if you think that Moses was supposedly trying to get the children of Israel to worship one true God, but he was quite happy for them to worship a brazen snake. And the fuss he made over the golden calf doesn't seem to make sense. But if you consider that originally Yahoo was represented by a bronze or brazen serpent, it makes a lot of sense. Again, this is a speculation, but the archaeology backs it up. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there were something like 234, at least 234 deities worshipped by the Canaanite cultures from the middle of the second millennium right up to the middle of the Iron Age. And I have just simply chosen 76 at random, just to emphasize the point. Now, all the ones in green were worshipped by the Israelites at some time or another, including Baal, El, Asherah, Ashtoreth, Ashtar, Anat, and Yahweh's original name was Yah or Yahu, and eventually this is a more modern interpretation that it's pronounced Yahweh, although the name is supposed to be unpronounceable. There are loads of images, graven images and sculptures that come from the archaeological deposits of these deities. This one, for example, we're not sure if it's Baal or El, but it comes from Israel, and it comes from just after the middle of the second millennium BCE. It's made of bronze, and it's coated with gold leaf. And there are quite a few of these that you can find in museums. Now, if you thought that they only made these little tiny things, because this little chap here is about 25.5 centimeters high. Just consider that quite recently they found 2 scepter heads in Israel. The one on the left, one at the top left, is 12.5 centimeters high, just the head, and the one on the bottom is 11 centimeters high. And if you can imagine the whole figure that once held that sculpture, it was probably nearly life-size. And that's in Israel. Here's a sculpture of Baal from Syria. Baal was often linked with fertility, rain and water, and also thunder. And here is a very old depiction of Asherah. It comes from the lid of a little jar. And she is portrayed in a way that became very symbolic later, that she's shown feeding these 2 goats. She's often shown with goats. She's often shown with trees or groves. She is often shown naked as a female. That's very important. She has a strong mother aspect to her as a mother goddess, and she is a creatress. She's a very powerful deity in her own right. Now, this cult stand was found also relatively recently, and it dates back to the middle of the 10th century BCE. Now, if somebody like Solomon and David had actually lived, and I have no doubt they did, but we just don't have any evidence for it, this comes from the period when Solomon and David were kings of Israel. And this tells you a lot about how they worshipped. We can see a depiction of Asherah at the bottom, placed between 2 lions. And above her, you can see the 2 goats eating at the tree of life. And on the back, which I can't show you, there's an empty section which they think once had a depiction of Yahweh. And that's just a little detail of the goats eating the tree. And this amazing find from northern Syria has an inscription on it. And this dates sometime between 850 and 750 BCE. And it says, the Eternal One, Olam, has made a covenant oath with us. So it's talking about the concept of a covenant around about, say, 800 BCE, which fits in, if you like, with the story that Yahweh made a covenant with Moses at Sinai. But then again, most of these cultures were making covenants with their deities. It was a very common thing. In fact, for kings, when they took over a particular culture, they would make a covenant with them, and they would inscribe the details of the covenant on 2 separate tablets. One tablet would be given to the oppressed, dominated people as a reminder, and the king, the sovereign who had dominated them, would keep the other copy, which may give some background to the reason why the Bible talks about 2 tablets being given to Moses. But this text goes on to say that Asherah has made a pact with us. So she's also making a kind of a covenant with the people. And we know from this inscription that the god they're talking about here is El. So this is an earlier depiction of El as the senior god of the Canaanites. And it mentions the great council of all the holy ones. That's the divine council I was talking about. So here we have an actual inscription telling us that this is very typical of Canaanite culture, that you have your leading male and female deity, and you have your divine council of holy ones. All of this is going to be inherited by the Israelites and later the Judahites. The oldest known inscription which mentions Yahweh is this Meshastela, which is written in Moabite text. And I must just tell you, there were different. Aramaic had already become the lingua franca of the Neo-Assyrians, which I will talk about just now. And from it evolved languages like Hebrew, and the different Canaanite cultures at this time, in the first millennium, were all speaking an early form of Hebrew, but different types of Hebrew. Israelite Hebrew is the only Hebrew that survived, which we know today. Anyway, Yahweh is mentioned on this stone as the defeated, as the king of the defeated people. The Moabite king is bragging how he beat the Israelites. Most fascinating of all is this pair of pithoi. And pithos is the Greek word for a big storage jar. And they were found at a place called Kuntilet Ajrud, which is on the eastern side of the Sinai. And you probably can't see the depictions very clearly here because they're very old and faded, but you can see at the top Hebrew written in a Phoenician text, and you can see two figures side by side in the foreground and a figure in the distance on the right. And now here is a diagram to illustrate what's happening here. And you will see that the figure of the male on the left has a penis and the figure of the female has two breasts. So we're pretty sure that's supposed to be Yahweh and his wife Asherah. And in the distance, there's another female doing something, possibly playing a musical instrument. The young calf sucking from the cow is in fact a symbol of Asherah because she's the mother and she suckles her offspring. Some people have commented that the two figures, which look very ugly, may be influenced by the Egyptian god Bes. Now, Bes is a little dwarf with a hideous head, and it is possible, since this Sinai region is very close to Egypt, that perhaps the way of depicting the god was influenced by Egyptian culture. Not impossible. If that is so, it means that the penis on the Yahweh figure is not his penis, it could be his tail. We're not sure. But let's look at the inscriptions. They tell us a lot. I have blessed you by Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah. May he bless you and may he keep you and may he be with my Lord. May the Lord Yahweh bless you and keep you. That's almost the words of the Levitical prayer where Yahweh is prayed to that he will bless and keep you and may his face shine upon you, which shows a very ancient source for that particular wording. May he lengthen their days and may they be sated. Recount to Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah. Yahweh of the Teman has shown them favor, has bettered their days. So we know that the people here living to the south, which is very close to Moabite territory, they are worshipping Yahweh as their main deity. Asherah is his consort. Here's another inscription on the wall, the plaster work found at the same site. And this says, the parts that we can still read, and when El shone out from the summit, and the mountains dissolved, and the peaks crushed, trampled across the earth, over the stones he veered, and he prepared for the blessed one of Baal on the day of battle, for the name of El on the day of battle. So this is interesting, because this is the same site, and here we see very old names like El and Baal being used to describe the main deity. And here's another detail of an image off of that pithos, which shows the two goats nibbling at the tree of life. When we look at inscriptions from seals, for example, which come from this period, it's very interesting that the kings of Israel were using imagery which is a direct crib of Egyptian culture. So look at the one on the left. You see your four-winged urias, which is a winged serpent, which is purely Egyptian. Then you see very archaic Hebrew written in Phoenician text with an ankh, which is a symbol of life from Egypt, and then a winged solar disk at the bottom. And on the right, we have on an Israelite seal an image of Horus kneeling on a lotus flower, which is linked to the worship of Osiris. This stamp, which was produced in the middle of the 8th century, shows clearly a scarab beetle supporting a solar disk in its front legs and possibly on its back legs with 4 wings. And it's very, very similar to, say, a typical Egyptian scarab holding the sun disk from Egypt at this time. Now, that image on the right from Egypt, we call it a keper, which is an aspect of the sun. When the sun rises in the morning, it represents rebirth, because the sun has gone to sleep, it's gone under the Nile, and it's come up in the morning, and it's a new sun. And they believed that the sun was like a big ball of dung being rolled through the heavens by a giant dung beetle, and that's why the dung beetle becomes the symbol of resurrection here. And as the sun rises, as it gets right overhead to noon, it then becomes Ra, who is the king of the gods. He's the main guy. And then it starts to set, and it becomes Amun, an old man, as he's dying. So, considering that the Israelites are using the same symbolism, we're assuming here that they are using this to have some link with their main deity. And now we have an aspect of a solar connection with Yahweh. And that's not unusual, because if you read some of the Psalms, there's one Psalm which actually refers to God as the sun. And also the prayer where you wish that Yahweh shines his face upon you could also have solar implications. Samson, for example, in Hebrew, Shamshon could mean little sun. Here's some more royal seals. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, there are loads of publications available where you can go and examine this for yourselves. Notice that we have Egyptian symbols and we have Hebrew text. King Ezekiel, one of the first kings of Judah, after the destruction of Israel by the Neo-Assyrians, you can see that he is also using the winged solar disk and also the winged scarab beetle. And these little goddesses made out of clay, there are loads of these things that are found in archaeological sites. They're referred to as pillar figurines, and we suspect that they refer to Asherah because they're emphasizing the fact that she's a mother goddess, creator goddess. Okay, so now we come to the fun bit. I'm going to quickly show you what happened from the Neo-Assyrian conquest down to almost the present day. First of all, I just want to repeat by showing you the various nations that made up the Canaanite states after the Egyptians left. And you can see the Phoenicians I only showed you the southern tip of the Phoenicians, and you can see the Phoenicians' territory goes all the way up the coastline on the east coast there of the Mediterranean. And from the north, at the beginning of the 10th century, we have the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And you can see by the shape of that empire that it follows the river system where the fertility is. And those of you who have done this at school will know that we call this the Fertile Crescent, because the civilizations that grew up in this area all followed the rivers, and it just makes a natural crescent shape on the map. Okay, so now we do a little detail. We go in and look at these Canaanite nations, and you can see the Assyrians at the top pressurizing them. And the first thing the Assyrians did was they put pressure on the Phoenician states. They didn't stop the Phoenicians from functioning, but they controlled very strongly what they were doing through their port system. Then they went into the kingdom of Ammon and turned that into a vassal state. This is sort of the mid-8th century. They put pressure on the kingdom of Judah, which capitulated, became a vassal state. The Moabites were also pushed. Edomites were pushed. And the Philistines became subservient to them. And we have loads of inscriptions. I've got some pictures there on the right of some of the famous prism inscriptions. And these and others, and if you read them, they tell you step by step what various Neo-Assyrian kings did and how they treated these people. The Neo-Assyrians were probably one of the most violent cultures that's ever been on this planet. If you want to know about horrors, just read what these kings did to their subjugated nations. Really horrendous by modern standards. I mean, an act of mercy would be to put your eyes out so that you were still alive, or to cut a hand off. Really horrendous stuff. They impaled people, skinned people alive. They were really horrific. And all these nations capitulated because they could not stand up to the might of the Neo-Assyrians. The king in Damascus wasn't behaving as he should, and so that was wiped out. Same thing to Israel. Israel was basically taken off the map. The only people left who still worshipped Yahweh were the people in the south, in the area that we know today as Judah, which eventually became Judea under Roman times. So if you look now at the big picture, the big map, you can see that we have Judah, Ammon, and Edom, and the Philistines are basically vassal states, and Phoenicia, of course, and then we have the Neo-Assyrians in the north. But that's not the whole story. The next thing that they did is they took people from the conquered lands, Israel, for example, and Aram Damascus, and they sent them to all parts of the empire. They then took people from all parts of the empire and sent them back, not only to Israel and Aram Damascus, but everywhere. This was a normal military weapon of the Neo-Assyrians, a very clever weapon, because if you want to control 20 different cultures, you don't want them kept together, isolated, so that they can gang up against you. What you do is you split them up and you divide and conquer, and you mix them up all over the empire. So if you've got an Israelite now living in Carchemish, for example, they're out of place. They cannot gang up against you. They're not going to find allies there. And the same, if you take somebody from Carchemish and stick them in Israel, they're out of place. This is a very clever tactic. And it should be considered a military weapon, which is what it was. And as you will see, the Neo-Babylonians copied the Neo-Assyrians and used exactly the same methods. By the time we get to about 669 BCE, Judah had been now demoted to the position of a province. It was no longer a kingdom. They got rid of the king altogether. Neo-Assyria was hugely powerful. It took over the whole of Egypt. They also expanded into the north, as you can see at the top of the map there, into the kingdom of Urartu, for example. And then, in about 639, we have a complete change. The Neo-Babylonians take over. And all that really happens is your leadership changes, the land stays pretty much the same, and we have now the Neo-Babylonians owning very much the same land that the Neo-Assyrians owned. And Judah now has a new master. And the Neo-Babylonians came into Judah, and they did the same thing that the Neo-Assyrians had done to the Israelites. They simply took various people. If you read the inscriptions from the Neo-Babylonians and you compare it to what the Bible says, we're pretty sure the Bible has very accurate accounts of this, that the people who were removed were elite Judeans. These are your upper-class Judeans, the ones who have an education, the ones who can do administration duties. And so these people were not slaves in the true sense of the word. They were used to be administrators for the army, for agriculture, and they were sent all over the Babylonian Empire, not just to Babylon. And on that point, if I just go back to that picture, a lot of people have this idea that the people in Judah are now Jews. We don't know that for sure. Not in the modern sense of what it means to be a Jew. The Judeans, if we read between the lines, there's a possibility that they were starting to consider Yahweh alone, and they certainly had been moved to get rid of Asherah. And if you read the accounts of Josiah, for example, from the Bible, we're told that he took the cult objects out of Solomon's temple and he had them burnt. And it tells us specifically that he burnt Asherah, Baal, and cosmic deities, or the starry deities, as they called them. So this is a time of change, but I cannot believe that overnight they just suddenly stopped being monolatrist and became Yahweh alonists. That is just not possible. But that is what we are told to believe if you read the priestly writings. Regardless, even though a lot of important people were taken out of Judah, it doesn't mean that the people staying behind in Judah were now not affected by the Babylonians. They were just a province of the Babylonians. They're simply part of Babylonia. They're right in the middle of it. So Babylonian culture is going to affect you whether you leave or not. And that point seems to get missed when people talk about the Babylonian exile. Very soon after this, sorry, what I should have mentioned, I didn't mention, my mistake. This is also the destruction of the Second Temple. Nebuchadnezzar II comes into Jerusalem, and he does it 3 times, in fact. And on the 3rd time, he loses patience and he destroys Jerusalem's walls and he pulls down the temple. Very soon after that, the Neo-Babylonian Empire falls to another empire called the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And the hero, if you like, of the story here is a guy called Cyrus II, or the Great, who is considered in Jewish culture to be a highly respected messianic person who saved the Jewish people. He is recorded, or the claim is made, that he allowed the exiled Jews to return to Judah. So if you think that they were now Jews, you can say that, but he certainly allowed the Judahites to return. But the facts are the Judahites didn't want to return. Why would they? They were now in jobs. They had families. This was 50 to 60 years after the exile. They were comfortably ensconced now in much more fertile lands. Why would you want to go back to a semi-desert? And this is where the story gets interesting. We believe that this is the beginning of stories that were told, like the Moses story, for example, to encourage people to come back to Judah. So they tried to tell people, this is your land. This is the land that God gave you. You have to come back. And one of the important prophets of this period is Jeremiah, for example. We also know that Cyrus, although he apparently let the people rebuild their temple, he wasn't actually the one who paid for it. It was much, much later, under the rule of Artaxerxes II and Darius II, for example, that the money was found to start rebuilding the temple. The rebuilding of the temple took a long time. It wasn't an overnight thing. And we know now that the second temple seems to have been only for Yahweh, whereas the first temple, as we know from the Bible itself, also contained cult objects for other deities. So the second temple gives us a clue that the Judahites now, they're starting to become Jews in the normative sense of the word. This is the beginning of proper Judaism, where you have Yahweh alone as your deity. Asherah is removed. She's considered now a foreign deity. Baal is a foreign deity. The starry deities, the cosmic deities, the sun, the moon, they are no longer considered valid deities, and they are considered foreign. Okay, so now, this is an interesting period also because after this period, we know that the priests who gained control of the leadership of the Jewish people started to invent, if you like, a story where the past was couched in terms of being a golden age. Israel was held up as being a golden period where Solomon and David were these ideal kings. Even though we know that those people were monolatrists and were certainly not monotheists, they are portrayed in the Bible as though they were only worshipping Yahweh. Well, that's the implication. People like Nehemiah and Ezra, for example, Nehemiah especially, started to preach in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas of Judah about worshipping Yahweh alone. And this raises another issue. When the Judahites were in Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire, those who wanted to speak to one of their national deities like Yahweh would have had a problem because they would have considered their God to be a national deity. Because these people believed that other people had gods and they had gods and they were all real. It was just a matter of giving your allegiance to one. And so if your national deity was in Judah and you're now living, say, in Ashur, how can you pray to Yahweh? Because he's not there, he's in Judah. And we believe that it was about this time that a very major philosophical concept was created, or if you like, a big penny dropped. People started to realize that maybe you can worship Yahweh anywhere. And that's a very big step. That's the next step in monotheism. That's when you believe that your God is a universal deity, not just a national deity. And a similar thing happened with the Zoroastrians. Originally, Ahura Mazda, who's the supreme deity of the Zoroastrians, was only worshipped in Iran or Persia. But eventually he became an international deity, a universal deity. Very similar story with Yahweh. So around about this time, we're not sure exactly, but certainly by 450, Yahweh is now worshipped alone. They still believe other gods exist, but they also believe that Yahweh is international, that he's universal. And after that, It's a progressive thing to the point where you don't believe that anybody has a God except the one God. But that only happens after you've accepted the universal characteristics of your deity. The Achaemenid Persians had a huge influence on the development of nascent Judaism. We think a lot of the ideas that exist in Judaism come from borrowings from Achaemenid Persian culture. And the Achaemenid Persians, for the most part, seem to have been Zoroastrian. Whether they were Zoroastrian in the modern sense is unknown, but they worshipped Ahura Mazda, who was a god of wisdom and love and kindness. And they also introduced something else into Jewish culture, which hadn't been there before, and that is the concept of evil, the concept of a negation, a personification of evil. Because normative Judaism doesn't have evil. God is good, end of story. There's no devil in early Judaism. But the Persians believed in a twin deity, if you like. The Ahura Mazda and the Angra Mainyu were twins. One was evil, one was good, one created, one destroyed. And you chose which path to take. And if you look at the writings of the later Essene community, the Yachad, the Sons of Light, and also the Pharisees, you will notice that they start to personify evil. They start to talk about God making two spirits in the beginning of time, evil and good. This is not mainstream Judaism. This is a new idea creeping in. And I personally believe it comes from Achaemenid ideas and probably later from Hellenistic ideas, but this is where it starts. And if you look at this coin, for example, minted in Israel, you can see that it looks very Persian. All right. And this is when the Persians are starting to decline. We can see that Yahweh is actually presented here as an anthropomorphic being. You can see that he's sitting on something with wings, which refers back to when he was portrayed as a solar disk with wings, or a beetle with wings. He's holding a bird on his hand, which I'm not sure what that means. He's got the wheel of a chariot that he's on. It sort of reminds me a little bit of Isaiah and his dreamlike image of God appearing on a divine chariot, surrounded by four divine beings. And you can see in the background, written in Phoenician, Old Phoenician text, or Paleo-Hebrew, the word Yachad. And we're not sure if that is in fact meaning, well, because we know the Persians called the area Yahud, but it could also be Yahweh. We're not sure. The last letter is badly formed. I think it's safer to say that says Yahud, but the as I say, the jury is still out on that one. So let me end by saying, let's go back to the original Sunday school account of God's existence on earth. And if you look at what was believed before compared to what we know from archaeology, you can see there are major differences. And there are also some similarities, but the similarities only start coming into play when we get into more recent history. So the first four, from the 4000 to 1100 BCE period, we can safely assume is pure myth. And myths are all about creation. Myths are designed to explain to people how things came into being. The stories of Samuel, or Saul, David, and Solomon, certainly, there's no reason to doubt that there was, in fact, a David and Solomon. It's quite possible these people existed, but they didn't exist in the way the Bible portrays them. They may have been chieftains or leaders of their people. Certainly, they are more legendary, if you like. And then we have the story of Israel being destroyed. That is quite accurate. We have the story of Neo-Babylonians destroying the temple. That is very accurate. What happened to the kings, the number of people who were exiled, there's no reason to disbelieve that. That fits in a lot with the inscriptions that we get from the cultures that did the destroying. So we know we can actually back that up with evidence. And I think let's leave it at that. And if you have any questions, we can embroider upon that.
No, I don't think I have really any questions to add, except maybe one. When you look at the parallel between the male deities you were showing earlier, constantly having Asherah as the consort.
Yes.
What do you think that's going on there? Do you think those male deities are also being confused for one another since they're being given the same wife?
No, absolutely. The point is, originally, El and Asherah held the roost for all the Canaanites, or most of them, let's say 90% of them. So when they became nations, they basically adopted that blueprint, that template. So El technically still remains the main deity, and Asherah, his wife, remains the female. So that's why you see that blueprint carried on. That's why that happened. It's obviously there are other things happening as well, more subtle, but that's the major thrust of things. And the fact that they all referred to their major deities as El or Baal later as titles shows how dominant that was. It had been around El's been around from at least 2,900 BCE, so that's at least a couple of thousand years of programming, if you like. It's going to be very difficult to throw that out, when you're considering your deity, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The last question I have is, do you have any thoughts on the Elephantine papyri? I know there's different scholarly interpretations of this, but that seems to mention Anat Yahu as a consort of Yahweh over there, as opposed to Asher.
Anat, you're talking about Anat, the goddess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, Anat was worshipped by the Israelites and the Judahites. It's quite possible. Again, we're dealing with broad sweeps here of the paintbrush. There is no reason, for example, to believe that in one corner of ancient Israel, people were worshipping something completely different. Unfortunately, we've only got two sources here. We've got the Bible, which unfortunately has been redacted and interpolated by priests to tell a particular narrative. And that's dominated the story. That's the first problem. The second thing is that we're only able to reconstruct what happened based on the remains of bones and stones that haven't been destroyed. It's a jigsaw puzzle with many missing pieces. It's and one can. I mean, for example, I can say in a broad stroke, yes, the people were polytheists, and they certainly the royal family must have pushed a particular line that was copied by a lot of people. But there must have been loads of different groups in the countryside doing their own thing. I mean, it can't just be homogenous across the whole country. And we know from the Bible itself, it tells us that the priests were very angry because people were worshipping. Making their own altars in other parts of the country, and they said, "No, you're going to stop that. You're gonna. That's illegal. You've got to come and only worship in Jerusalem." That's, and I think that actually did happen because it makes sense. But you don't want people spending their money somewhere else. You want them to come to a central point where you can, fleece them. And we know, for example, that the priests, by the Hellenistic period, had even invented coins with pictures of the animals that were going to be sacrificed on them, because they didn't have time to sacrifice all these animals. Can you imagine, a couple of million people coming into Jerusalem for 3 major festivals in the year, and you've now got to sacrifice all their doves and sheep and whatever? It's just not going to happen. It's complete nonsense. So what they did is they sold them coins, which had the picture of the animal on it, sort of a surrogate for the actual sacrifice. And it's interesting, in the New Testament, Jesus is made to whip the moneylenders in the temple, And if there's any truth behind that story, it makes sense that they were money lenders in the temple, but they weren't lending money. They were swapping coins for money. And that's what the problem was. What he was actually saying was, you're not doing it properly. You're supposed to take the animal and sacrifice it to Yahweh. You're not supposed to swap it for a coin, do it symbolically. So there's an actual example of what's going on, what's happening on the ground. People have their own private beliefs, and the priests force them to drop those and centralize the religious worship.
And I'd like to remind everybody that the link to purchase Nicholas's books will be in the description below, including a link to his website. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's lovely seeing you again, Jacob. Well, I can't see you. I can see a picture, but I presume you can see me.
Yeah, you still have your share screen up.
Yeah. So I'll say good night and strength to your arms, and I'll be in contact over the next few days.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.